dawn on November 17, 1944, broke over the shattered village of Voyer, like a breath held to long thin gray, and trembling. Frost glazed the shattered brickwork of what had once been the town's bakery, its ovens now cold graves for charcoal and ash. The air carried the metallic temps of spent artillery, overlaid with the damp rot of autumn leaves pressed into the mud by boots, tanks, and the dragging feet of men too numb to mourn. Somewhere beneath the rubble of Rue de la Guerre, a pocket watch ticked, its glass face cracked, but its heart still beating, counting seconds no one else heard. And then, cutting through the silence like a scalpel through gauze, a voice faint cracked, unmistakably calling a name, Claire. Claire Dubois stood motionless in the center of the ruined street, her nurse's cape stiff with dried rain and old blood, the hem frayed from months of dragging through shell craters and collapsed field hospitals. She had not returned to Normandy to witness this. She had come to bury Joseph, her younger brother, whose dog tags had finally been recovered from a mass grave near St. Lay 2 weeks prior. But now, her name spoken not in memory, not in echo, but with the raw insistence of someone who believed she might still answer, froze her in place. It had been for months since the Allies pushed through this sector, since the last German artillery barrage reduced Voyer to a skeleton of chimneys and splintered beams, for months since she'd last treated a patient here. Her hands slick with plasma and prayers, stitching wounds by candlelight while mortars screamed overhead. Yet there it was again, Claire. Not a shout, not a cry, but a whisper threaded with exhaustion and something eerily intimate, as if the ruins themselves remembered her. She turned slowly, her boots crunching over broken roof tiles, her eyes scanning the collapsed facade of what had been the village pharmacy. Boards hung askew over the doorway, charred black by phosphorus. A rusted pharmacy sign creaked in the wind, its letters half melted, Pharmacy Vert. She hadn't noticed it on her way in, no one had. The town had been declared cleared by Allied engineers weeks ago. No survivors, no booby traps, no reason to linger. But Claire knew better than to trust declarations. In the winter of 43, she dug a French resistance courier out of a collapsed cellar in Cannes, using only the sound of his fingernails scraping stone. She learned then that silence wasn't empty, it was full of the things people stopped listening for. She stepped forward, her breath curling in the cold air, like smoke from a dying fire. The voice didn't come again, but the silence that followed wasn't the silence of abandonment, it was the silence of waiting. Her fingers brushed the cold brick of the pharmacy wall, tracing a hairline fracture running vertically through the mortar. Then she saw it, a sliver of fabric caught in the rubble-faded blue wool, the kind used in British Army grey. She crouched, pulling gently. It didn't tear, it was anchored by weight beneath. Heart hammering against her ribs, she began to move stones, her nails splitting against frozen mortar, her shoulders burning with the effort. A beam groaned as it shifted, releasing a puff of dust that glittered in the weak morning light like ground glass. Beneath it, half buried in a collapsed stairwell leading to what might have been a cellar, lay a man. He was unconscious, his face streaked with grime and old blood, one eye swollen shut, the other fluttering beneath a crust of dried serum. His uniform was unrecognizable patches of British khaki fused with French civilian wool, stitched together with what looked like fishing line. A makeshift sling held his left arm against his chest, the bandage stained yellow with infection, but his lips moved, even in unconsciousness. They shaped a single word, Claire. She knew him instantly. Not by name, she had never learned it, but by the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a souvenir from the Falaise pocket in August. He'd been one of the walking wounded she'd treated outside Baija, drifting in and out of consciousness for 2 days while she changed his dressings and spooned broth between his cracked lips. He'd spoken little French. She spoke no English beyond medical commands, but on his third night, delirious with fever, he'd gripped her wrist and whispered, "If I don't wake up, tell my sister in Liverpool I kept the photo." She'd nodded, not understanding, but promising anyway with her eyes. He woke the next morning, lucid enough to smile before being loaded onto a truck bound for Cherbourg. She'd assumed he'd made it home. Now, here he was, buried, forgotten, breathing only because the cellar had formed a pocket of air when the building collapsed. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, a pulse steady, irregular, but there, she unslung her medical satchel, the leather cracked from salt and sweat, and pulled out a morphine syringe. Her hands, usually steady as a metronome, trembled as she injected it into his thigh. Then she unscrewed her canteen and poured a few drops onto his lips. He swallowed reflexively, a sound like dry leaves scraping stone. "Who left you here?" she murmured, though she knew the answer. In the chaos of retreat and advance, men vanished, sometimes into graves, sometimes into the cracks between armies. Records burned, convoy lists got lost. A missing soldier became a statistic, then a footnote, then nothing at all. She'd seen it happen dozens of times. But this time, it was different. This time, he had called her by name, not nurse, not mademoiselle, but Claire, as if he'd been waiting not for rescue, but for her. Footsteps approached from the north, boots on gravel. She didn't look up. A voice called out in accented English, "Madame Dubois." It was Sergeant Wilkins, the British liaison attached to the Graves Registration Unit. "We've been looking for you. Your brother's remains are ready for transport." He stopped short when he saw her kneeling in the rubble, her hands covered in dust and blood, the unconscious man at her feet. "Christ, is he one of ours?" "He was," Claire said quietly, adjusting the blanket she'd draped over the man's chest. "Now, he's mine." Wilkins frowned, glancing at his clipboard. "There's no record of any survivors in this sector. Envire's been swept twice." "Then they didn't look hard enough," she replied, not unkindly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent years listening to what others dismissed as noise. Back at the temporary morgue set up in the ruins of Vire's church, Claire washed the man's face with warm water from a dented pot, revealing features younger than she remembered, maybe 23, with sandy hair matted to his forehead. His dog tags were gone, but sewn into the lining of his coat, she found a water-stained photograph, a girl with braids and a crooked smile, standing beside a bicycle in front of a red brick house. On the back, in pencil, "Maggie, Christmas 42. She tucked it back carefully, then began cleaning the wound on his arm, peeling away layers of infected cloth. Beneath, the skin was mottled purple and yellow, but the bone hadn't broken through. He'd survived this long on sheer will and perhaps on the belief that someone would come. That night, as rain began to fall again, drumming softly on the corrugated tin roof of the field hospital tent, the man stirred. His good eye opened, unfocused at first, then locking onto Claire's face with dazed recognition. His lips parted. "You came back," he whispered in halting French. "I didn't know you were here," she said, adjusting the IV line she'd rigged from scavenged equipment. "But you heard me," he insisted, his voice cracking. "In the dark, I called and called. I thought I was dreaming you." She paused, her hand hovering over his forehead. "You weren't dreaming." Outside, thunder rumbled over the Norman hills, a sound too much like artillery for comfort. But inside the tent, there was only the hiss of the kerosene lamp, the drip of the four, and the fragile thread of breath between two strangers bound by a name spoken into the void. And Claire, who had buried more men than she could count, felt something shift inside her, not hope, exactly, but the stubborn refusal to let silence be the final word. The man's name was Thomas Elistami, to his mates in the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division, and, for 3 days, as the November rains turned the fields around Viora into sucking mud, Claire refused to leave his side. She slept in a folding chair beside his cot, waking at every hitch in his breathing, every flicker of pain across his face. Infection had settled deep in his left shoulder, the wound weeping, a thin yellow fluid that smelled faintly of almonds, a sign of gangrene kept barely at bay by sulfa powder and sheer luck. He drifted in and out of fever dreams, sometimes speaking in rapid English she couldn't follow, sometimes whispering French phrases he'd picked up from farmwives and medics. "Merci Claire, ni pars p***, don't go." By the 4th morning, he was lucid enough to sit up, his voice still raw but his eyes sharp with clarity. Over weak tea brewed from salvaged leaves, he told her what he remembered. His unit had been part of the push through VOR in early August, tasked with clearing snipers from the upper floors of the town's few standing buildings. They'd taken the pharmacy without resistance. "Too easy," he said now, shaking his head. "We thought the Jerrys had pulled out, but they'd just gone quiet." That night, a delayed demolition charge hidden in the cellar, Wall detonated as his platoon slept in the rooms above. The blast didn't kill him outright, it buried him. He'd woken in darkness, pinned beneath a collapsed floor joist, his left arm useless, his canteen shattered. The others were gone, either dead instantly or evacuated before the building fully collapsed behind them. No one had heard his shouts, or if they had, they'd assumed the ruins were empty. For weeks, he'd lived on rainwater that seeped through cracks in the rubble and the stale biscuits he'd kept in his pack. He'd marked time by scratching lines into a loose brick with a nail. 37 days, he thought. Maybe more. When the fever took him, he began to dream of Claire not as she was in Bayeux, but as she appeared in his delirium, standing in a white room filled with light, holding a basin of clean water, calling his name, and then, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "One morning, I heard you. Not in my head, outside real. I thought I was dying, but I called anyway." She didn't tell him that she'd come for her brother, that his voice had cut through her grief like a signal through static. Instead, she changed his dressing in silence, her fingers working with the precision of years spent stitching flesh back together under fire. But something had shifted between them, not romance, not even friendship yet, but a bond forged in the liminal space between death and return. He was a ghost who had refused to fade, and she, who had spent the war tending to the dying, had somehow pulled one back. Word of his survival spread quietly through the Allied medical chain. A British captain from Graves Registration came by the next day, clipboard in hand, eyebrows raised. "Ellis, Thomas, R." he read aloud, then glanced at the man in the bed. "You were declared Kier on August 11, 1944, buried in Plot F, row 12, Vieille Memorial Cemetery." Tommy's face went pale. "My sister. She received your effects." Personal letter was sent in September. Claire watched as Tommy's hands clenched the thin blanket, his knuckles whitening. To be dead on paper was one thing. To know your loved ones had mourned you, that was another kind of wound. Later that evening, as Claire prepared a new batch of antiseptic from iodine crystals and distilled water, Sergeant Wilkins approached her outside the tent. The rain had let up, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth and diesel. "HQ's sending a transport for Ellis tomorrow," he said, not meeting her eyes. "They want him debriefed. Then he'll be shipped to a convalescent hospital in England." She nodded, stirring the solution slowly. "He's not ready to travel. Orders are orders, Nurse Dubois. He'll develop sepsis in transit if he's jostled too much. His fever hasn't broken." Wilkins sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I get it. But he's not your patient anymore. He's a recovered Kia. Paperwork's already being rewritten. His family thinks he's a ghost. They need to know he's real." "I know," she said softly. "But someone needs to make sure he stays real." The next morning, before dawn, Claire did something she had never done in 5 years of war. She falsified a medical report. On official Red Cross letterhead, she wrote that Private Ellis required at least 10 days of bed rest under observation for suspected spinal trauma lie, but one plausible enough to delay his transfer. She signed it with her full name and rank, though she held no formal military commission, only a civilian nursing credential from Lyon. If caught, she could be dismissed, even detained. But as she watched Tommy struggle to lift his head from the pillow, his breath shallow and rapid, she knew the risk was worth it. For the next week, she kept him hidden in a disused supply shack behind the main hospital tent, bringing him food under her coat, boiling bandages in a dented pot over a spirit lamp. At night, when the ward was quiet, she sat with him, listening, as he described Liverpool its docks, its rain, the way his sister Maggie used to braid his mother's hair before the funeral. In return, Claire told him about her childhood in Provence, about the olive trees on her family's farm, about Joseph's laugh, which sounded like stones tumbling down a hillside. They spoke in fragments French, English, sometimes a mix of both, building a fragile bridge across the chasm of their separate wars. Then, on the 8th night, as a cold wind swept down from the bocage, Tommy asked the question she'd been dreading. "Why did you stay?" She looked at the lantern flame, its light trembling on the walls. "Because no one else was listening." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I've been thinking. That cellar. It wasn't just random. The Germans rigged it to collapse after troops moved in, but they didn't use a timer. They used a pressure plate hidden under the staircase. I only noticed it because I dropped my canteen, saw the floor shift." Claire frowned. "You told someone." "I tried, reported it to Lieutenant Harris the next morning. He said I was paranoid." "Jerry's gone. Ellis, stop seeing traps in every cobblestone." He coughed, wincing. "But it wasn't just Vior. I heard other lads talking buildings collapsing after we cleared them. Always when we slept, always with no survivors." A memory surfaced in Claire's mind, a conversation overheard months earlier between 2 American engineers near St. They'd been laughing about Jerry's last trick, booby-trapped ruins that seemed to swallow whole squads. "Probably just bad luck," one had said, buildings weakened by shelling. But Tommy wasn't convinced. And now, neither was she. The next day, she visited the Graves registration office under the pretense of finalizing Joseph's paperwork. While Wilkins was distracted, she slipped into the records room and began pulling casualty reports from towns retaken after Operation Cobra Mortain. She found a pattern. In each, there were clusters of structural collapse, deaths occurring 12 to 48 hours after liberation. Not random, not accidental, synchronized. That evening, she showed Tommy the notes she'd copied onto scraps of paper. His eyes narrowed. "They're using the ruins as weapons," he said. "Let us take the town, then let the town kill us." She nodded. "And no one's connecting the dots because the men who saw it happen didn't survive to tell, except him, except her, because she had listened, because he had called." And in that shared silence between ruin and recovery, a new kind of vigilance was born, not with guns or codebooks, but with attention, the most overlooked weapon of all. By late November, the first hard frost glazed the fields outside Vior, turning the mud to iron and the puddles to mirrors that reflected a sky bleached of color. Claire moved through her days with the quiet urgency of someone who knew time was running out. Tommy's fever had finally broken, his strength returning in slow, halting increments, enough to sit upright for an hour, enough to hold a spoon without trembling, enough to sketch rough diagrams in the dirt with a stick. He drew the pharmacy cellar as he remembered it, the staircase, the wall with the false brick, the pressure plate disguised as a loose floor tile. It wasn't wired to explosives, he explained one afternoon, his voice still raspy but steady. It triggered a support column to collapse. Silent, no blast, just gravity doing the work. Claire studied the sketch, then compared it to her notes from other towns. In Mortain, a cafe collapsed on a platoon of Canadian engineers 2 nights after liberation. In Domfront, a schoolhouse swallowed a dozen American MPs during a rainstorm. No explosions, no enemy fire, just sudden, total implosion. The pattern was undeniable, methodical, patient, diabolically efficient. The retreating Germans weren't just laying mines or snipers, they were turning the very architecture of occupied France into a trap, a delayed killing field designed to bleed the Philly allies long after they'd raised their flags. She brought her findings to Captain Moreau, the French liaison officer attached to the Allied Civil Affairs Unit. He listened politely in his temporary officer-requisitioned farmhouse with peeling wallpaper and a wood stove that smoked tan, then set her notes aside with a sigh. "Mademoiselle Dubois," he said, lighting a Gauloise with hands that had once commanded a battalion at Berhackheim, "you are a remarkable nurse. But this is engineering, demolitions, intelligence work. Leave it to those trained for it." "But men are still dying," she insisted, her voice low but firm. "Not in battle. In beds. In buildings we think are safe." Moreau exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "War leaves wounds in stone as well as flesh. Some collapses are inevitable. We cannot treat every ruin as a weapon." "Then at least warn the troops," she pleaded. "Tell them not to billet in recently cleared structures without checking foundations, load-bearing walls, stairwells. We have engineers for that," he interrupted, though his tone softened. "Go back to your patients, Claire. You've done enough." She left without another word, but the dismissal settled in her chest like shrapnel. That night, by lantern light, she and Tommy pored over a captured German engineering manual. She'd traded a bottle of penicillin for a slim, water-stained booklet filled with diagrams of controlled demolitions. Buried on page 43 was a reference to Trümmerfallen rubble traps, used during the retreat from Eastern Europe. The technique relied on calculated structural sabotage, weakening key supports, embedding delayed release pins, using the weight of upper floors as the killing force. It required precision, patience, and intimate knowledge of masonry. And, crucially, it left no trace of explosives, only rubble that looked like the natural aftermath of war. "They're not just hiding," Tommy murmured, tracing a finger over the Germans. "They're curating the ruins." The next morning, Claire did not go to the hospital. Instead, she borrowed a bicycle from a local farmer, its tires patched with inner tube rubber, and rode 6 kilometers east to the village of Turenia, recently liberated and already filling with Allied troops, billeted in cellars and attics. She arrived just after noon, the streets alive with the clatter of jeeps and the laughter of soldiers who believed the worst was behind them. She found the town's central in its roof half gone, its facade pockmarked with bullet holes, and asked to speak to the lieutenant in charge of billeting. He was a young American from Ohio, barely 20, with a fresh second lieutenant's bar and a holstered .45 he hadn't fired in anger. He listened to Claire's warning with polite skepticism. "Ma'am, our engineers swept this place yesterday, said it was stable. Did they check the cellar supports?" she asked. He blinked. "The what?" She walked past him without another word and descended the inn's narrow stone stairs into the cellar. The air was damp and cool, smelling of mildew and old wine. She ran her hand along the central support column, cracked in a clean vertical line, the mortar around its base suspiciously fresh. At the base, a loose cobblestone sat slightly higher than the others. She didn't touch it. Instead, she backed away slowly, her pulse loud in her ears. "Get everyone out," she told the lieutenant when she returned. Now, he hesitated. "On whose authority?" "On the authority of the man who survived Vior," she said, her voice low and steady. "And the dozens who didn't." Reluctantly, he ordered the evacuation. 32 men filed out grumbling into the muddy courtyard, their packs slung over shoulders, their cigarettes still lit. Claire stood at the cellar door, watching, waiting. An hour passed. Then too, nothing happened. The lieutenant shook his head, muttering something about nurses' nerves, but Claire didn't move. She knew the triggers weren't always immediate. Some required vibration, a truck passing overhead, boots stomping on floorboards, the weight of sleepers shifting in their cots. She waited until dusk, until the cold began to bite through her thin coat, and then, just as the first stars pricked the violet sky, the cellar floor gave a soft, almost imperceptible groan. A plume of dust rose from the stairwell. The support column cracked further, the stone splitting with a sound like a dry bone snapping. Within minutes, the entire rear half of the inn collapsed inward, silently, completely, as if the earth had inhaled. The soldiers stood frozen in the courtyard, their faces pale in the twilight. The lieutenant turned to Claire, his earlier skepticism replaced by something akin to awe fear. "How did you know?" "Because I listened," she said simply, "and because someone finally taught me what to hear." Word of the Torini incident traveled faster than she expected. Within 3 days, a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers team arrived in Vior, requesting her presence. They were led by Major Elena Rostova, one of the few female officers in the Allied Engineering Command. Sharp-eyed woman with a Russian accent and a reputation for dismantling bureaucratic inertia. She listened to Claire's evidence without interruption, then turned to Tommy. "You saw the mechanism." "Yes, ma'am. Can you rebuild it?" Tommy exchanged a glance with Claire. "If I have materials and time." Rostova nodded. "You'll have both. We're setting up a test site outside St. Lay. You'll replicate the wire trap. We'll see if your theory holds." It was the break they needed, but it came with conditions. Claire would not be officially attached to the project. Her role would be consultant, unpaid, uncredited, her access contingent on Rostova's discretion. And Tommy, still technically a recovered KIA, would be under military escort at all times. They accepted without hesitation. In a fenced clearing, 20 kilometers north of Sik, surrounded by skeletal apple trees and the distant rumble of supply convoys, they began their work, using salvaged bricks, timber from bombed-out barns, and scavenged metal pins. Tommy reconstructed the pharmacy cellar to scale. Claire documented every step: the depth of the pressure plate, the angle of the weakened support, the precise amount of weight needed to initiate collapse. Engineers watched, initially skeptical, then increasingly absorbed. On the 5th day, they activated the mechanism with a sandbag simulating a sleeping soldier. The collapse was instantaneous, silent, total. Major Rostova stood in the settling dust, her notebook open, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Claire. "We've lost 142 men to accidental building collapses since July. We thought it was shoddy construction. Now I see it was design." She issued an immediate field order. All troops were forbidden from occupying recently liberated structures without structural inspection by trained engineers. Using Claire and Tommy's checklist, a one-page document detailing telltale signs of tremorfall: mismatched mortar, hairline cracks in load-bearing walls, suspiciously loose floor tiles near stairwells. The order went out the next day, and in the quiet that followed between the clatter of typewriters and the hum of radio traffic, no one noticed the civilian nurse and the resurrected private who had turned observation into armor. But the buildings stopped falling, and men stopped vanishing into the ruins. December arrived with a vengeance. The Norman countryside locked in a deep freeze that turned shell craters into ice-rimmed bowls and made the hinges on tent Flaps shriek like wounded animals. At the test site near St. Lay, the ground crunched underfoot like shattered glass, and breath hung in the air long after words were spoken. Claire and Tommy worked through the cold, their hands wrapped in rags to preserve dexterity, their faces chapped raw from wind and fatigue. Major Rustova had expanded their mission, not only to identify trauma fallen, but to develop a rapid field protocol for neutralizing them. Engineers from 3 allied nations now rotated through the site, watching Tommy demonstrate how a single wedge of hardwood, driven beneath a compromised support beam, could redistribute weight, and by hours, sometimes days before, a controlled demolition could be staged. Word of their success began to ripple outward, not as headlines, but as quiet adjustments in the daily rhythms of war. In Belgium, a Royal Engineer unit used Claire's checklist to uncover a rigged townhouse in Liege that had already claimed to Pages during a snowstorm. In Aachen, American sappers discovered a network of delayed collapse mechanisms in a former Gestapo headquarters, all set to trigger when the heating system was activated. Each report filtered back to Restova's desk, and each time, she appended a single line in her log: pattern confirmed, method attributed to Dubois' protocol. Yet despite the lives saved, Claire remained on the margins, never saluted, never briefed, never invited into the map rooms where decisions were made. She was a ghost in the machinery of war, her contribution acknowledged only in the absence of catastrophe. Even Tommy, now formally reinstated to active duty, was told to keep his role discreet. "We can't have soldiers thinking they're being saved by a nurse and a private," an intelligence officer had muttered during a debrief. "Undermines command authority." But the war had no patience for pride. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their last great offensive through the Ardennes. Snow blanketed the forests, radios crackled with confusion, and entire divisions vanished into the white chaos. In the scramble to reinforce the front, reserve units were pulled from rear garrisons, including the engineers trained in the WWII protocol. Within days, newly liberated towns along the Belgian border were filled with exhausted troops seeking shelter in cellars, attics, abandoned shops. The risk of Trümmerfallen returned, magnified by haste and desperation. Claire watched the news arrive in fragments, radio bulletins, courier dispatches, the hushed conversations of doctors returning from forward aid stations. She felt the old helplessness creep in, the sense that her work had been a pebble thrown into a storm. But then, on December 22nd, a coded telex arrived at Rustova's office. It came from Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was surrounded and freezing. Amid reports of ammunition shortages and wounded piling up in barns, a single line stood out: detected rigged structure in Central Square, using D checklist, prevented collapse of CP request protocol dissemination to all units. Rustova called Claire into her office that evening. The stove hissed in the corner, casting long shadows across maps pinned to every wall. "They're using your method in the bulge," she said, without preamble. Unofficially, no orders, no manuals, just men passing the checklist hand to hand like a prayer. She slid a sheet of paper across the desk. It was a carbon copy of the telex, smudged with coffee and mud. "You've saved more lives this month than most generals will in their careers, and no one will ever put your name on a report." Claire looked at the paper, then out the frosted window at the skeletal trees swaying in the wind. "I don't need my name on it," she said quietly. "I just need them to listen." Rustova studied her for a long moment, then she reached into her desk and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "I've been keeping a record," she said. "Not for the chain of command, for history. When this is over, someone should know who saw what the experts missed." She handed it to Claire. Inside were dated entries. The last page read, December 22, 1944, 0. Structural collapse fatalities reported in Bastogne sector, first since July. Claire closed the book without a word and tucked it into her coat. Back at the Viora Field Hospital, now reduced to a skeleton staff as resources poured into the Ardennes, she found Tommy packing a duffel bag. His orders had come that morning: reassignment to a re-echelon engineering unit tasked with training new sappers in Trümmerfallen recognition. He was leaving in 2 hours. "You're not coming back, are you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He shook his head. "They need me where the fighting's fresh, where the ruins are still warm." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed her a small object wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was the photograph of Magnal, creased and stained, but carefully preserved. "I made a copy for my sister," he said. This one's for you. So you remember, you were the reason I got out of that cellar. She took it, her fingers brushing his. You got yourself out, she said. I just heard you. He smiled faintly, the first real smile she'd seen since August. Guess that's all it takes sometimes. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind whistling through the tent flaps, the cold pressing in from all sides. Then he shouldered his bag and walked out into the dusk, his silhouette vanishing into the gray landscape like a figure receding into memory. That night, Claire sat alone in the emptying hospital, the leather notebook open on her lap, the photograph beside it. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and steady, blanketing the ruins of Voyeur, in a hush so profound it felt sacred. She thought of Joseph, buried now in a neat row beside hundreds of others, his name carved into stone. She thought of the men who had vanished into collapsing walls, their deaths dismissed as accidents, and she thought of Tommy, walking into the storm, carrying her method like a lantern dot in the morning. She packed her own bag. She had done all she could here, but the war wasn't over, and somewhere, in another ruined town, another voice might be calling a name into the dark, waiting for someone to hear. She left before dawn, her bicycle loaded with medical supplies, her coat lined with Rostova's notebook, and the photograph of a girl in Liverpool who would soon learn her brother was alive. The road ahead was long, icy, uncertain, but for the first time in years, Claire didn't feel alone. She carried with her the quiet certainty that observation, when honed by empathy and sharpened by refusal to accept the official story, could be as powerful as any weapon. And so she rode east, toward the sound of distant artillery, listening not for commands, but for whispers. By March 1945, the winter had cracked open like an old shell casing, revealing the raw, muddy bones of a continent exhausted by war. Claire crossed the Rhine on a pontoon bridge, lashed together with frayed cables and prayer, her bicycle now replaced by a requisitioned sidecar driven by a Belgian medic with a broken nose and a knack for finding petrol. She wasn't enlisted. Not officially, but Major Rostova's quiet intervention had secured her a temporary civilian pass, attached to the Allied Advance Reconstruction Unit, a bureaucratic fiction that allowed her to move behind the front lines with purpose. Her mission remained unwritten, unspoken, to listen where others assumed silence, to look where others saw only rubble. She found new ruins, in Cologne, in Bonn, in the shattered suburbs of Frankfurt, cities where the Allies moved swiftly, claiming victory before the dust had settled, and in each, she walked the cellars and courtyards with the checklist she and Tommy had perfected, her eyes scanning for the subtle betrayals of engineered collapse, mortar to pale, bricks too neatly aligned in a ruin, floor tiles that shifted underfoot like teeth in a dying jaw. In a former bakery in Koblenz, she spotted a pressure plate, disguised as a coal chute cover. In a schoolhouse near Wiesbaden, she found load-bearing beams cut halfway through and held upright by tension wires wrapped in rags. Each time, she alerted the engineers. Each time, a trap was disarmed before it could claim lives. But it was in a village outside Kassel, on a rain-slicked afternoon in early April, that she heard it again, the voice. Not Tommy's, not her brother's, a child's voice, thin and trembling, calling from beneath a collapsed apothecary. Maman. Claire froze. No troops were billeted here. The village had been evacuated days earlier, yet the voice came again, weaker this time, as if fading with each breath. She dropped her satchel and began digging, her hands clawing through wet plaster and splintered wood, ignoring the protests of the young American corporal who'd been assigned to escort her. Ma'am, we've got orders to move. There's a child, she said, not looking up. Under the stairs. He hesitated, then joined her. Together, they exposed a narrow void beneath a collapsed staircase's space, no larger than a coffin, shielded from the blast that had leveled the building by a fallen oak beam. Inside, curled in a wool blanket soaked through with rain, was a girl no older than 6, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with terror. She clutched a porcelain doll with one arm missing. Claire wrapped her in a dry blanket from her medical kit and held her close, murmuring in French, then German, then just sounds, wordless hums that carried no language but comfort. The girl didn't speak, but she stopped shaking. Later, at a displaced persons camp outside Hanau, Claire learned the girl's name was Lena. Her parents had died in the bombing that preceded the Allied advance. She'd hidden in the apothecary cellar when the soldiers came, too afraid to emerge. She'd been there for 3 days, surviving on rainwater and the last crust of bread in her pocket. When asked how she knew someone would come, she simply pointed to Claire and whispered, "You were looking." The word struck Claire like a physical blow. She had spent months teaching soldiers to see what others missed, but the child had seen her, seen the way she studied the ruins, not with the cold eye of an inspector, but with the tenderness of someone who believed life might still linger in the wreckage. By May, the guns fell silent. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended not with a roar, but with a slow, disbelieving hush, the kind that follows a scream held too long in the chest. Claire remained in Germany through the summer, working with unrelief teams to clear booby-trapped buildings and repatriate displaced families. Ristova's notebook, now filled with hundreds of entries, was quietly archived in London under Technical Innovations, Civil Affairs Branch, its authorship redacted. Tommy Ellis returned to Liverpool, where he embraced his sister Maggie. On the dock, beneath a sky washed clean by rain, he sent Claire a letter in July, a single page, written in careful French. They're rebuilding the pharmacy in Vior. They've left the cellar sealed, but they've planted lilacs above it. I like to think they're for you. She never replied, not because she didn't care, but because words felt too small for what had passed between them. In September 1945, Claire returned to France for the last time, not to Voyer, but to her family's farm in Provence, where the olive trees still bore fruit, despite the years of neglect. She buried Joseph's dog tags beneath the oldest tree, the one he'd climbed as a boy, and let the soil take them as it had taken so much else. She never sought medals, never gave interviews, never wrote memoirs. When historians later inquired about the sudden drop in non-combat structural fatalities during the final months of the war, down 97% from July 1944 to April 1945, no one connected the statistic to a civilian nurse who had once heard a name called from the dark. She lived quietly, tending the groves, helping rebuild the village school, teaching local children to read by the same lamplight that had once illuminated her field notes. Visitors sometimes asked if she ever dreamed of the war. She would pause, her hand stilling over a book or a basket of olives, and say only, "I dream of listening." Because in the end, that was the lesson: not that one person could change the course of war, but that war could be changed by those who refused to stop hearing the voices the world had decided to ignore. In an age that worshipped grand strategy and thunderous firepower, she had wielded something quieter, rarer: attention, the kind that notices a loose brick, a whispered name, a child's breath beneath the rubble. And decades later, when old soldiers gathered in Vieux to honor the fallen, they would sometimes speak of a nurse who walked the ruins after the battle was done, searching not for glory, but for echoes. They said she never found all the voices, but she found enough to prove that sometimes the most powerful act in a world bent on destruction is simply to stop, lean close, and listen.